I knew the moment they said it. I'd never forget those words. "You're embarrassing her," whispered the woman 2 seats away from me, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. She didn't say it with anger, she said it with pity, and somehow, that stung more. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth, the edges of my napkin clenched tight between my fingers. The laughter around the table didn't pause. The clinking of glasses, the polite smiles, the inside jokes, I wasn't part of it. All continued as if I hadn't just been reduced to a burden in front of strangers. I looked at her, my daughter, sitting across from me in her sleek dress, hair done in a way I couldn't afford when I raised her. She didn't say anything. She didn't correct the woman. She just looked down, fiddling with the stem of her glass, pretending she hadn't heard. I wanted to shrink, to disappear into the chair, but instead, I sat up straighter, my heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't belong at that table, at least not in their eyes. I wasn't polished, wasn't impressive, wasn't useful anymore. I was the woman who had packed her school lunches and waited outside dance rehearsals in a secondhand coat. And now, I was embarrassing. I had said yes to dinner because she invited me. I had put on my best blouse, even bought new shoes. But none of that mattered now, because someone decided I didn't fit, and no one rushed to say otherwise. I folded my hands in my lap quietly and let the rest of the evening play on pretending. For the moment that I wasn't already rewriting the ending in my mind, I kept my eyes on the centerpiece, pretending to admire the arrangement of overpriced flowers, anything to keep from looking at her. If I met her eyes, I was afraid I'd see it the truth. That maybe she agreed. That maybe she'd been wishing all night I hadn't come. I remembered how proud she sounded on the phone when she invited me. "It's just a little dinner with people from work," she'd said. "You'll love it." I had believed her. I wanted to believe that we were still connected in a way that went deeper than status or style. But here, at this table of polished strangers, I felt like an exhibit someone regretted showing off. They all wore the same kind of confidence and effortless. And I'd spent the morning fixing the hem on my blouse because I couldn't afford a new one. I'd stood in the mirror reminding myself to speak less, to smile more, to not take up too much space, because I knew what world she lived in now, and it wasn't one I'd ever been invited to join. The waiter poured more wine I wouldn't drink, and laughter rose again like a wave I didn't belong under. I had paid for her to reach this world, but no one at this table knew that. No one saw the woman behind the woman. I wasn't asking to be applauded, I just didn't expect to be erased. But in that moment, as the candlelight flickered against the glasses and no one looked my way, I began to understand. Maybe silence wasn't grace anymore? Maybe it was just the last mask I hadn't learned to take off. The woman who whispered to me had gone back to sipping her wine, as if her words hadn't cracked something open. She didn't even look my way again, and my daughter, she laughed at someone's joke, nodded along to a story, her face relaxed like nothing had happened. That was what unsettled me most, the ease with which she let the moment pass. I tried to remember the last time she had introduced me as her mother. It had been a while. Lately, I had become someone who helped raise me, or a close family friend. I never corrected her. I told myself she had her reasons, that the world she lived in didn't make room for complicated truths. But tonight, those reasons felt like excuses, and the weight of all the times I'd stayed quiet was starting to press against my chest. I looked down at the table. The bill hadn't arrived yet, but I could already feel the tension forming around it, the subtle glances, the wallet-shifting rituals of the well-off. I knew that moment well, the awkward silence that always followed the final bite. But tonight, I wasn't going to wait for it. I wasn't going to sit through another round of polite charity or invisible shame. Something inside me had moved. Not out of pride, not even out of hurt, but out of clarity. I had given her everything I had once. Maybe now it was time I gave myself something too, not validation from them, just a moment of truth, one that belonged only to me. The morning after, I sat at the small kitchen table I'd had for over a decade, tracing the rim of my chipped mug while the kettle hissed. The quiet of my apartment felt heavier than usual, like it was holding back everything I hadn't said. The night before, I replayed it all in slow motion, the way the words had landed, the silence that followed, the way she had looked past me. I kept asking myself, was I really an embarrassment? Or had I just grown too small in her story? There's a certain kind of ache that comes from giving someone everything and watching them become someone who forgets that you did. I didn't regret raising her. I never would. But somewhere between school uniforms and college applications, I had lost my seat at her table. And what hurt wasn't the whisper, it was that she didn't fight it. That silence of hers, it screamed. I remembered how proud I was when she first got that job, how I'd printed the announcement and taped it to my fridge. It's still there, curling at the corners. I used to think that one day she'd look back and see me clearly, But maybe that day wouldn't come, and maybe I had to stop waiting for it. I finished my tea, washed the mug, and stood for a moment in the kitchen light, letting it warm my shoulders. The truth was simple. I had raised her to stand on her own, but I had forgotten to do the same for myself. And maybe it was time to start. Later that afternoon, I took out the small envelope where I kept a few folded papers, receipts, notes, documents I never showed anyone. In between them was a crumpled printout from her first semester's tuition. My name wasn't on the official file, but the payment was mine. I remembered the day I made it. I had pawned a gold chain my mother left me to cover the balance. I walked 6 blocks under the rain to hand it in on time. She never knew that. She only saw the acceptance letter. I never told her because love shouldn't need an invoice. But as I held that paper in my hands, I felt something shift. Maybe love doesn't need to be measured, but sacrifice deserves to be seen. That dinner table hadn't hurt me because I was insecure. It had hurt because they didn't see the ledger of my life, the one written in skipped meals, worn-out shoes, extra shifts and holidays spent alone so she could feel normal. I wasn't just the woman who raised her. I was the woman who believed in her when no one else did. And that shouldn't have made me small, it should have made me unshakable. I folded the receipt carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into my bag. Not to use as a weapon, not even to prove anything, but as a quiet reminder to myself, I had been there, fully, generously, unseen. Yes, but never absent. I didn't need to shout that truth. I just needed to stop hiding it from myself. That evening, I received a message from her, just a short one. Thanks for coming. Sorry if it was awkward. No punctuation. No real emotion. I stared at the screen for a while, rereading the words like they might transform into something more. But they didn't. It was a gesture, not an apology. A digital pat on the back, the kind you give when you know something felt off but aren't ready to face. Why? I thought about replying. I even typed out a few things. It's okay. Don't worry about it. I understand. But none of them felt true because I wasn't okay. I was tired. I was tired of understanding, tired of translating my value into silence, so I deleted the draft and turned off the phone. I walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Moving, people laughing, someone walking a dog wrapped in a ridiculous little sweater. Life was going on, and somewhere in that movement, I felt something loosen inside me. Not bitterness, not anger, just the end of a long-held hope that she might one day look back and realize everything I'd done. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. But that couldn't be my anchor anymore. I reached for my coat and the envelope still in my bag. I didn't know what I would do with it yet, but I knew I wouldn't bury it again. Some truths deserve to breathe, and some women, like me, deserve to take up space, even if it means standing alone at the table once more. A few days later, I found myself walking past the restaurant where the dinner had taken place. I hadn't planned. It was just on my way home from the market. But the moment I saw it, something in me paused. Through the tall glass windows, I could still picture the table where we sat, the exact chair I had occupied, half tucked in, half present. I stood there for a moment, watching other people laugh inside, strangers to my memory, but familiar in their comfort. And I thought about how many times I'd dimmed myself down in rooms like that. Not just for her, but for others too, to keep the peace, to not embarrass anyone, to avoid becoming too much or out of place. I'd mastered the art of quietness, of shrinking my voice so others could feel tall. But in doing so, I had disappeared even from myself. I walked away slowly, groceries rustling against my leg, and I made a decision before I even fully realized it. I wasn't going to wait to be invited to take up space again. I would choose it for myself. So I went home, opened my wallet, and counted the small savings I had tucked away, enough for a gesture not to impress, but to reclaim. I called the restaurant, asked for the manager, and said I wanted to settle the bill from a few nights ago. I could hear the confusion in his voice. It's already been split, he said. I know, I replied, but I'd like to pay it all quietly. I gave him my name, my full name, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like it was finally mine again. The manager hesitated at first, asking me if this was some kind of mistake. You don't need to do this, he said gently, as if he could sense something deeper behind my calm voice. But I smiled and said, I want to. There was no drama in my tone, no bitterness, just certainty. He took my payment, confirmed the amount, and offered to notify the others. I politely declined. No need to mention me, I said. Just let them know it's been handled. When I hung up, I didn't feel heroic. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady, as if I had finally pulled my dignity back from the corners it had been hiding in. That bill, they probably assumed someone else covered it, or that the cost didn't matter, but to me it meant everything. Not because of the money, but because of the silence I broke with action. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send a message. I simply stood up, quietly, and owned a moment that was supposed to make me feel small. And somehow, that was louder than anything I could have said at the table. I went to sleep that night without rehearsing imaginary conversations, or regretting what I hadn't done. For once, the story didn't end with me wishing I'd said more. I had done enough. I had left my mark not for them to applaud, but for me to remember. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight the room, it's to stand, pay your part, and walk away with your head high. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and brewed a fresh cup of coffee. There was no noise, no urgency, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint sunlight crawling through the curtains. I sat by the window with my cup in hand, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something or someone to make things right. The silence didn't feel empty, it felt earned. I thought about the dinner again, not with anger this time, but with clarity. I could still see her looking away, still hear the softness of that awful whisper, "You're embarrassing her." But those words didn't define me anymore. They exposed something about her world, not mine. I had raised her with love, not perfection, with warmth, not polish. I had taught her how to be strong, how to keep going, how to work hard. And maybe, in her new world, those lessons had been repackaged into something shinier. But I knew the roots. I was the roots. And no whispered shame could undo that. I reached into my purse, pulled out the receipt from the restaurant. My copy and folded it into a small square. I didn't throw it away. I didn't need to. It wasn't about the paper. It was about the woman who had carried the weight silently for years, and finally decided to place it down. Not in anger, in peace. That morning, I didn't feel like a footnote. I felt like a chapter, a quiet one maybe, but one that mattered more than they ever realized. A few days later, she called. Her name lit up my screen the way it used to when she was away at school, and called just to say she missed home, but this time I hesitated before answering. Not because I didn't want to hear her voice, but because I wasn't sure which version of her I'd be speaking to, the girl I raised, or the woman who looked away when I was being erased. I answered on the third ring. She sounded unsure at first, her tone lighter than usual, like she was testing the temperature of something fragile. "Hey," she said, "I heard someone paid the bill from the other night." I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel it. "Yeah," I said finally. "I did." She went quiet. I could hear the breath catch in her throat. "You didn't have to do that," she said, softer now. "I know," I replied. "That's exactly why I did." Another pause. Then, "I didn't mean for any of that to happen. It wasn't supposed to feel like that." I looked out the window. The street was quiet, the trees swaying gently, like they weren't carrying anything heavy. "But it did," I said. "And that's okay." It showed me something I needed to see. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even trying to make a point. I just needed her to understand that I had reached the limit of erasing myself. She said she wanted to talk, more maybe even. Meet. I said we could, but this time it would be on my terms. No whispers, no shadows. Just two women, face to face. We met at a small cafe near her apartment neutral ground. She chose a table outside, maybe because it felt less formal, or maybe because it gave her an escape route if things got too heavy. I arrived a few minutes early, something I'd always done. Old habits, I guess. When she finally sat down across from me, she looked different. Not in the way she dressed, but in the way she looked at me. Less distracted, less guarded. "I've been thinking about that night," she said. "About how quiet you got, how small you looked." I nodded, letting her speak. I didn't step in. I should have. I know that. Her hands fidgeted with the rim of her coffee cup. And for a moment she looked just like the little girl who used to rehearse apologies for. "Broken dishes, you didn't deserve that," she continued. And I guess I was too afraid of what people would think if I said the truth out loud. I sipped my tea, listening. "You weren't afraid of them," I said gently. "You were afraid of how much I mattered." Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "Maybe I was," she admitted. "It's easier to keep people in roles. It's safer." I nodded again, not to absolve her, but to acknowledge the honesty. That moment wasn't about blame. It was about recognition. She was finally seeing the cost of what had been left unsaid for too long, and I wasn't asking for an apology. I was asking for space. Not as a guest, not as an embarrassment, but as someone who helped build the very life she now stood on. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, familiar in shape, worn at the edges. "I found this," she said, sliding it across the table toward me. "It was in the drawer of my old desk. I think you left it there years ago." I looked down. It was a card I had written to her before she left for university. Inside, I had written a short note, along with a line that read, "No matter how far you go, my pride follows quietly." I hadn't thought she'd kept it. She hadn't mentioned it in years. My hands stayed still as I stared at it. I read it again last night, she said, and I realized I've spent so long chasing things that made me feel important, and ignoring the one person who never needed a reason to be proud of me. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't cry. She just sat there, letting the moment land. I finally picked up the card and held it for a few seconds before placing it gently into my bag. It's not about what you say now, I told her. It's about what you choose next. She nodded slowly. I want to make room, she said, for the truth, for you. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't know what would come after this, but I knew I would no longer fight to be included. If she was ready to make space, I'd sit beside her. If not, I'd still stand with both feet grounded in everything I had already given. And that was more than enough. A week passed before we spoke again, not out of avoidance, but because something between us had settled. I no longer felt the need to chase validation, and she seemed to sense that. When she called, it wasn't to apologize or explain, it was to ask if I'd like to join her for dinner. Just us. No guests, no pressure. I said yes, but I made a quiet promise to myself. I would go as I am, not as someone trying to fit into a world I didn't choose. When I arrived, the table was small, the food simple. No formal place settings, no background noise of clinking silver or forced conversation. Just 2 plates, 2 glasses, and a woman who was finally learning how to sit across from her own history. She looked nervous at first, offering me a seat, pouring the water too fast. I smiled gently and took my time. You don't have to try so hard, I said, and she laughed in that shy way she used to when she was 10 and hiding something sweet behind her back. We ate slowly, spoke softly, and somewhere in between stories of her work and memories of her childhood, I saw something change. Not in her words, but in her posture. She leaned in more. She listened. She asked questions she had never asked before, out of guilt but out of curiosity. She was finally interested in who I was beyond the role I had played. And in that quiet room, with no witnesses but our own hearts, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, like I had been invited not just to the table but into her life again. Fully and by name. After dinner, she brought out an old photo album, the kind with sticky pages and plastic covers we used to fill together on rainy Sundays. I found this in storage, she said, placing it gently between us. I hadn't seen it in years. The cover was frayed, the edges worn, but the inside was still full of color. Page after page of moments, scraped knees, birthdays with lopsided cakes, school concerts where I sat alone in the crowd, clapping louder than anyone else. She turned each page slowly, sometimes pausing to smile, sometimes to wince. I forgot about this one, she whispered, touching a photo of us at the bus stop on her first day of school. I had made her a sign that said, "You've got this," written in glitter glue. She was so small, then so unsure, clinging to my hand, like it was the only solid thing in the world. You were always there, she said. Not a question, not a compliment, just truth. I nodded. I tried to be, I replied, even when it wasn't easy. She looked at me, her eyes no longer clouded by expectation or shame. I don't know how I forgot, she whispered. Maybe you didn't, I said gently. Maybe you just remembered too late. We closed the album together. Not to finish anything, but to let it rest. Some stories don't need fixing. They just need space to be seen. And sometimes, the most healing thing isn't hearing, "I'm sorry," it's watching someone learn how to see you all over again. And realizing they finally do. When I got home that night, I didn't rush to take off my shoes. I sat quietly by the window, the album still in my bag, my hands resting in my lap. The silence didn't feel like absence, it felt like reflection, like the gentle exhale after years of holding my breath. I wasn't thinking about what she owed me anymore. I wasn't counting sacrifices or replaying moments I wished had gone differently. Instead, I thought about how far I had come, just in raising her, but in finally raising myself, finding the courage to speak through silence, to stand without shouting, to walk away from spaces that asked me to shrink. I didn't need applause for paying the bill. I didn't need her to perform love at a dinner table. What I needed, what I had reclaimed, was my place in my own story. I looked around my home, not grand, but full of echoes that belonged to me, full of memories I didn't have to prove to anyone. That night I made a cup of tea and opened the window just enough to let the cool air in. It brushed against my face like a quiet reward. No spotlight, no stage, just peace. And in that stillness, I knew something for sure. I hadn't embarrassed her, I had carried her. The shame was never mine. It just took me years to see it. Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong until you reminded yourself who you truly were?